Slavery is a practice that has existed for thousands of years, and while it has been officially abolished in many parts of the world, it continues to impact millions of people globally. The history of slavery is complex and diverse, with various forms of slavery and different cultural attitudes towards the practice. The transatlantic slave trade is perhaps the most well-known example of slavery, but there are many other forms of slavery that had existed throughout history and continue to persist in modern times. In this video, we will explore the history and impact of slavery, as well as the efforts to combat and eradicate modern-day slavery. Slavery refers to a condition in which an individual or group of individuals is owned by another person or group of people, and forced to work without pay or freedom, under the threat of violence or other forms of punishment. Historically, slavery has been a widespread practice throughout the world, with slaves typically being treated as property rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Today, slavery is illegal in most countries, but still persists in various forms, such as forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, and child labor, among others. The word slavery comes from the Old English word sclaver, which was derived from the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. The Slavs were frequently captured and sold into slavery in medieval times, and the word "slagvir" came to refer as the condition of being enslaved. Later, the term slavery was adopted by other European languages and became the standard term for practices of owning and exploiting other human beings. Slavery was a common practice in Mesopotamia, the region that is now known as Iraq. It was a complex system that lasted alongside other forms of labor, such as wage labor and endured servitude. In Mesopotamia, slaves were acquired to various means, including capture, war, the bondage, and the sale of children by impoverished parents. Slaves were considered property and could be bought, sold, or inherited like any other form of property. While slaves performed a wide range of tasks, including domestic work, agriculture, and skilled trades, they were often used to build public works such as temples and walls, and were sometimes employed in the military. Despite their low status, slaves in Mesopotamia had some legal protections. They could own property, enter into contracts, and even marry and have families. However, they were not allowed to bear witness in court or bring legal action against a free person. The conditions of slavery in Mesopotamia varied widely depending on the master and the type of work being performed. Some slaves were treated relatively well, and while enjoyed a measure of social mobility, while others were subject to brutal treatment and harsh living conditions. The Hammurabi Code of Law was a set of law created by the Babylonian king Hammurabi around 1754 before Jesus Christ. The code covered a wide range of legal issues, including slavery. According to Hammurabi's code, slaves were considered property and were subject to the same rules and regulations as any other form of property. However, there were also certain protections for slaves outlined in the code. For example, a master who killed his slave was required to pay a fine, while a slave who killed his master could be put to death. The code also outlined for the treatment of slaves, including requirement that they would be provided with food and shelter, and they would be allowed to marry and have children. Slaves also purchased their freedom, either through payment or through intervention of a third party. Overall, Hammurabi's code provides a glimpse into the complex legal attitudes towards slavery in ancient Mesopotamia. While slaves were considered property and the subject of whims of their master, there were certain protections in place to prevent outright abuse and mistreatment. Slavery was also common in ancient Egypt, which existed along other forms of labor such as wage labor and endured servitude. Slaves in ancient Egypt were generally acquired through warfare, the slave trade, or as a form of punishment for crimes. Slavery was not based on race or ethnicity. and it was possible for slaves to rise in status through various means such as marriage or military service. Slaves in ancient Egypt were employed in a variety of tasks, including domestic work, agriculture, and constructions. They were used to build domestic public works that are still visible today, such as the pyramids and temples. Slaves were also used in mining, and some were trained as skilled craftsmen. The conditions of slavery in ancient Egypt were not uniform and varied depending on the social status of the slave owner and the type of work the slave was performing. Some slaves had better living conditions and were treated relatively well, while others were subject to harsh treatment, including physical abuse and forced labor. Despite their harsh conditions, some slaves were able to obtain freedom through various means, such as purchasing their freedom or being granted freedom as a reward for faithful service. Slaves who were freed could become a part of free population and even acquire property and own slaves themselves. Slavery played a significant role in ancient Rome, with estimates suggesting that around 1/3 of the population were slaves during the Republic and early Empire periods. Slaves in ancient Rome were acquired through various means, including capture and war, piracy, and the slave trade. Some slaves were born into slavery, as the children of slaves were also considered slaves. Slaves were used for a variety of tasks, including domestic work, agriculture, mining, skilled trades. Some slaves were even employed in positions of trust and authority, such as personal assistants or secretaries. Slaves in Rome had legal rights and were considered property rather than people. They could be bought and sold and subjected to punishment or execution by their master. However, some slaves were able to earn their freedom, and these freed slaves, known as freedmen, were granted some legal rights and protection. The conditions of slavery in ancient Rome varied in the slave and the master. Some slaves were treated relatively well and had relatively comfortable living conditions, while others were subject to treatment including physical abuse and forced labor. Despite the harsh conditions, some slaves were able to choose close relationships with their master or other members of the free population. Some even gained renown as artists or writers, such as the Greek slave Aesop, who became famous for his fables. While there is evidence of slavery within Slavic societies, there were also instances where Slavic people themselves were subject to slavery by other groups. One notable example of this is the enslavement of Slavic people by the Ottoman Empire. Beginning in the late 14th century, the Ottomans began a campaign to capture and enslave Slavics from the Balkans, particularly from areas that are Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia. These individuals were taken as prisoners of war or captured during the raids of the village, and then sold into slavery throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The enslavement of Slavic people by the Ottomans continued for centuries, with estimates suggesting they were forced into war by various industries, including agriculture, mining, and domestic service, by millions. They were also used as soldiers, with many Slavic boys being taken from their families and raised in the Ottoman Empire. The slave trade in Slavic people eventually came to an end in the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire declined and various reforms were implemented. However, the legacy of this period of enslavement continues to impact the region today, with many Balkan countries still struggling with issues related to nationalism and ethnic tensions. Slavery played a significant role in Islamic societies and the Ottoman Empire for many centuries. Slaves were acquired through a variety of means, including warfare, piracy, and slave trade, and were used for a wide range of tasks. In Islamic societies, there were strict rules governing the treatment of slaves, and Islamic law required that slaves be treated humanly and provided with basic rights, such as access to food, clothing, and medical care. However, despite these rules, many slaves were in rash treatment, including physical abuse, forced labor, and including physical abuse and forced labor. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire was regulated by a complex legal system that was designed to protect the rights of both slaves and their owners. Slaves in the Ottoman Empire were employed in a wide range of tasks, including domestic work and military service. Some slaves were even employed in positions of authority and played important roles in the government and military. Although the Ottoman Empire officially abolished slavery in the 19th century, then practice continued in some areas for many years, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula and parts of Africa. Slavery was finally abolished throughout the Islamic world in the 19th century, although forms of exploitation and forced labor persist in some regions. Chattel slavery is a form in which people are treated as property and bought and sold like any other commodity. Under chattel slavery, slaves are considered to be legally and morally equivalent to livestock or other inanimate objects, and they have no rights or legal standing. The term chattel refers to movable personal property, such as livestock, furniture, or vehicles. In the context of slavery, it refers to human beings who are treated as property and can be bought and sold as commodities. Chattel slaves were often forced to work in harsh conditions with no pay or freedom of movement. Chattel slavery was a common form of slavery in many parts of the world, including the United States, where it was primarily practiced in the southern states before it was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865. Chattel slavery has also been practiced in other parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, and Europe, although it's been officially abolished in most countries today. Slavery has existed in Africa for thousands of years, with various forms of slavery being practiced in different parts of the continent. Historically, slaves in Africa were often acquired through warfare, debt, or punishment. In some part of Africa, such as the Sahara region and the Horn of Africa, the trans-Saharan slave trade played a significant role in the economy and culture for centuries. In other regions, such as West and Central Africa, the transatlantic slave trade, which involved the capture and forced transport of millions of Africans to the Americas, had a devastating impact on African societies. However, it is important to note that slavery in Africa was not a monolith or a universal phenomenon, and the forms of slavery and the treatment of slaves varied widely across different cultures. In some societies, such as the Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa, slaves were treated relatively well and were sometimes able to attain high positions of authority. In other societies, such as the Zagh rebellion in the southern Iraq, slaves rebelled against their masters and formed their own independent states. Today, slavery is officially illegal in African countries, although exploitation and forced labor still exist in some areas. The legacy of slavery continues to affect African societies and has contributed ongoing economic and social inequalities. The causes and effects of slavery are complex and multifaceted. There are some key factors that have contributed to the development and persistence of slavery throughout the history, as well as some of the long-causing impacts of slavery. Causes: economic reasons. Slavery has often been driven by economic factors such as the need for cheap labor to work in mines, plantations, or factories. Political reasons. In some cases, slavery has been used as means of political control, with conquered people being enslaved as a way of subjugating them. Social reasons. Slavery has sometimes been seen as a way of maintaining social hierarchies, with certain groups being deemed inferior and therefore suitable for enslavement. In the effects, we have the international trauma. Slavery has had a profound effect on the psychological and emotional well-being of slave people and their descendants, leading to long-lasting trauma and negative effects on mental health. The economic inequality. The legacy of slavery has contributed to ongoing economic inequality, with the descendants of slaves being often facing persistent poverty and marginalization, racism, and discrimination. Slavery has contributed to the development of racist ideologies and discrimination practice, with the legacy of slavery continuing to affect attitudes towards race and ethnicity. Cultural erasure. Slavery has often involved the forced suppression of cultural practice and tradition of slave people, leading to the loss of important cultural knowledge and heritage. International relations. The transatlantic slave trade, in particular, had a profound effect in international relations, with the forced migration of millions of Africans to America, shaping history and culture of those regions to this day. These are just a few of the many causes and effects of slavery. It is important to recognize the complexity and nuance of this issue and continue working towards the eradication of all forms of slavery and exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade was a brutal system of forced migration of Africans towards the Americas, which lasted from the 16th century to the 19th century. It is estimated that between 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly transported from their homelands and sold into slavery in the Americas. The slave trade was driven by economic reasons, with Europeans seeking the exploit of the labor of the enslaved Africans to work on plantations and in mines in the Americas. The trade was also fueled by racism and discrimination, with the Europeans viewing as Africans as inferiors and therefore suitable for enslavement. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was brutal and inhumane. Enslaved Americans were packed tightly into ships with little access to food, water, or sanitation. Many died during the voyage due to disease, starvation, or physical abuse. Once they arrived in the Americas, enslaved Africans were subject to brutal working conditions and often treated as property rather than human beings, as established previously. Families were torn apart, with children often sold away from their parents, and slave owners had complete control over the lives of their slaves. The transatlantic slave trade had a profound effect on African societies, with entire communities and cultures being uprooted and destroyed. It also had a lasting impact on the Americas, shaping the history, culture, and economic of those regions to this day. Despite the official abolition of slavery in the 19th century, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to affect societies around the world, with ongoing struggles for racial justice and equality. Slavery in the New World refers to a new system of slavery that was established in the Americas following the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the New World, where they were forced to work in plantations, mines, and other industries. The establishment of slavery in the New World was closely tied to the economic needs of European colonizers. European powers, particularly Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, established colonies in the Americas and began to cultivate crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane. These crops were labor-intensive and required large numbers of workers, leading to widespread use of enslaved Africans. Conditions for enslaved Africans in the New World were brutal, with many forced works in harsh conditions for long hours with little rest or protection from abuse. Enslaved Africans were also considered property and were bought and sold like any other commodity. Families were often separated, with parents and children sold to different owners. The system of slavery in the New World continued to the 19th century, when various abolitionist movements gained momentum and eventually led to the official abolition of slavery in most parts of the Americas. However, the legacy of slavery in the New World continues to impact the region, with many African descendant people facing ongoing discrimination and marginalization. The abolition of slavery has been a long and complex process, with the various forms of slavery being officially abolished in different parts of the world at different times. Here are some key milestones in the history of abolition. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, which abolished the transatlantic slave trade. This was followed by the Slave Abolition Act of 1833, which abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. In 1865, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution abolished slavery and voluntary servitude in the United States. In 1888, Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery while signing the Lei Áurea, or Golden Law. In the 20th century, the United Nations and other international organizations began advocating the abolition of all forms of slavery and forced labor. In 1956, the United Nations Supplementary Convention of the Abolition of Slavery was adopted, followed on the 1999 Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which aimed to combat modern forms of slavery and human trafficking. While slavery has been officially abolished in many parts of the world, it still persists in various forms, including forced labor, human trafficking, and debt bondage. Eradicating all forms of slavery and exploitation remains a crucial ongoing struggle for human rights and social justice. Modern-day slavery refers to various forms of forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, and other forms of exploitation that continues to exist in the New World today. Despite the abolition of slavery in most countries, millions of people around the world are still trapped in these forms of exploitation. Some of this modern day slavery include forced labor. This refers to a situation where people are forced to work against their will, often without pay and under terrible situations. This can occur in many industries, including agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. Human trafficking. It refers to the transportation of people with the purpose of forced labor or sexual exploitation. Victims of human trafficking are often lured with false promises or kidnapped, and then forced to work or provide sexual services. The bondage. This refers to situations where people are often worked to pay off a debt. Often the debt is manipulated by the employer or trafficker, and the worker is forced to work for long hours under harsh conditions. Child labor. This refers to the employment of children in various industries, often in dangerous exploitative conditions. Children are forced to work enough in order to support their families or pay off debt. Modern-day slavery is a complex issue driven by various factors, including poverty, inequality, and corruption. Eradicating modern-day slavery requires a concentrated effort from governments, civil society organizations, and individuals against the world. This can involve strengthening laws and regulations, improving working conditions, and increasing awareness about the issue. Slavery has a long and complicated history, spanning across the countries and societies. While the transatlantic slave trade is perhaps the most well-known example of slavery, various forms of slavery have existed throughout history and continue to persist in modern times. The abolition of slavery has been a gradual, ongoing process, with the various forms of slavery being officially abolished in different parts of the world at different times. Despite this progress, modern slavery remains a significant problem affecting millions of people around the world. Eradicating slavery and all forms of exploitation requires a sustained effort from governments, civil societies, organizations, and individuals around the world. Improving working conditions and increasing awareness about this. As we look into the future, it's important to continue the fight against slavery and exploitation. working towards a world where all people are free to live with their lives without fear of being trapped in these forms of exploitations. Thank you for listening to my video.